Hello everybody, welcome to Dakman Productions and welcome to Conrail. And I hope you enjoyed my last video where I ran a mixed consist of auto parts boxcars, 60 foot and the 86 foot high cube boxcars, and also running an early Conrail time period train where I had a SD40 leading and a Penn Central unit trailing, SD45. And I mentioned that my next video blog or vlog, I was going to talk about the transition times of different railroads. And I won't keep my subject just to Conrail to make it more interesting, which is why I'm wearing this Union Pacific shirt specifically for this video, so my Western railroad viewers will hopefully watch this as well, make it a little bit more interesting. So what am I talking about? What is the transition time of particular railroads? So we'll take the Conrail for example. Penn Central, New Haven, there was Lehigh Valley, Erie, Lackawanna. They were all basically taken and put into one railroad, and which formed into Conrail. Unfortunately, when this happened, there wasn't enough time to paint everything all at one time. So this is the transition period, the early years of when everything had to be switched over from Erie, Lackawanna, Penn Central over to Conrail. They didn't have all this time to paint everything. They did something they called patching instead of painting. And patching is where they left the original logo of the railroad they took over, in this case Penn Central, and the reporting marks, they just put they masked out a block. For the Penn Central would have been white, so they mask out a block, paint it white, and then put the new reporting marks in there, which would be CR, and then the road number that CR assigned it. They did this for Reading as well. On the Reading units or locomotives, they painted out a black box. So what they did is they just masked out over the original road number on the cab and the reporting mark, Reading, RDG I believe is what they used. And then once they masked all that out, they would paint it black. And then on the Reading units, they used white numbers. So they would have had white reporting mark, CR, and white road numbers. And we'll take a look at some pictures. So what got me interested in the transition times of different railroads is when I went to, I started going to the Run for Fun events, and they're all big Reading and Pennsylvania railroad fans. And so when they invited me to come over and run, I'm wearing my Conrail shirt, I'm bringing Conrail locomotives to run, and they're like, oh, really? Conrail? Conrail killed my railroad. I hate them. It's one of them things. So they put up with me bringing the Conrail stuff, and I got to know one member, and so we became friends and started busting each other's stones, basically. And I said, you know what? I want to make a Conrail takes over Reading run. I mean, it really happened. So I believe the Run for Fun one year was actually April 1st. If I'm not mistaken, it may have been. I can't remember. But at any rate, so I actually brought my Conrail train. A couple members gave me a couple Reading dummy units. I believe they were GP35s. And set me up with Reading and Pennsylvania train cars, And I made a Conrail takes over Reading, you know, the transition time where Conrail, I said, okay, Conrail takes over Reading, they're here to pick up the stuff, and off they went. And after I made that run, I really got interested in the transition times of different railroads. So this is the 2019 Run for Fun. I brought my Lionel Legacy Conrail GP30 over to the North Penn O-Gaugers and did a Conrail takes over Reading. Conrail was basically formed on April 1st, 1976. So I do that inaugural run where I take over Reading. And here I'm going through the Reading yard with Reading trains. So this is what pretty much got me interested in the post-merger or the transition era when the railroads become another railroad or by getting bought out or a merger. It really piqued my interest after I did that. And this is a very interesting subject, I think. And it's very rarely modeled in O-Gauge. Lionel and MTH both have created trains that were considered transition times. In other words, it would have a railroad name and then a different reporting mark of a different railroad. And we'll take a look at a couple pieces here. Another very interesting piece that I ran across, and I didn't know this because when I first started getting back into O-Gauge, I didn't know a lot about rail trains. I wasn't really a rail fan. And you have to remember, I'm really a truck person who does trains for a hobby. I'm not, or I like trains, but I work on trucks. That's what I do for a living. So I'm always learning about the railroads and trains. So there was a member at the Run for Fun who was running an Amtrak train. But what was odd to me, it was being pulled with Penn Central E-units. And I asked him about it. I says, well, I'm seeing a mix of different road names here. I'm seeing Penn Central, I'm seeing Penn Central Passion. I'm like, what is this train here? And he sort of giggles and he says, that's the transition time of Amtrak. When Amtrak first started, they did not have stuff painted in their own paint scheme. And I didn't know that. And so I started doing more research and reading more books on it and stuff. And then I found a lot of interesting things, like Amtrak had old Penn Central locomotives that still had the logo on them but had the Amtrak reporting marks on them. Or they even had the Pennsylvania GG1s, Amtrak did, before they got painted. And Amtrak GG1s, the early ones, were still in the Pennsylvania Tuscan railroad scheme. So I was like, wow, I didn't realize this. So here is the Lionel Legacy Amtrak passenger set that I was talking about, being pulled by an ex-Penn Central E8 unit. And this is really what Amtrak did. And you can see a mix of Penn Central with Amtrak and other road names that are in this Amtrak train. And this is pretty much another train during the 2019 Run for Fun event that really got me interested in post-merger or early transition eras of railroads. And it makes for an interesting train. The same thing with the Conrail. The early Conrail years are called the Rainbow Years. They called it the Conrail Rainbow Years because that's when Conrail got all these different locomotives from all these different railroads. And there was a whole lot of different models of locomotives that Conrail owned. If you're looking for them oddball, obscure locomotives, research Conrail. You'd be surprised at what they had that was odd and obscure. They had some pretty rare stuff during their early time period. So here's the Conrail Rainbow Years book I was talking to everybody about. And you can see on this one a Reading patched to Conrail locomotive is in the lead. And you can see over here, that seems to be Lehigh Valley patched to CR in the lead for Volume 2. Then Conrail, the Rainbow Years also covers commuter operations. Then Volume number 4, the Erie-Lackawanna commuter region. So if you want to, even if you're not a Conrail fan, if you like reading about the different odd and obscure locomotives, you're going to want to take a look at the, there was 3 different series of books that were produced or published, Conrail Rainbow Years, and there's volumes 1, 2, and 3. Great reading. If you want to do some research, even if you don't like Conrail, there's some great information in there about the different locomotives that were that they had. So check that out. And let me give you some Western railroad examples of transition times, and this is where Union Pacific comes in. So years ago, I was into G-Skill and was a big, huge Rio Grande fan, believe it or not. So when it comes to Rio Grande, I did a lot of research on that railroad as well. I'm not saying I'm some expert, but I know a lot about the Rio Grande main line. Not so much as the narrow gauge, because the narrow gauge really didn't interest me, but the main line part of the railroad. So Rio Grande has a very interesting history too, because they ended up getting the Western Pacific, and somehow or another, I'm not sure how the merger went, if it was a merger, I think it was a merger between Rio Grande and Southern Pacific, but they both still kept their separate road names. They didn't become one at that point in time, but I think Southern Pacific had a controlling interest of the railroad merger at that time. So I believe at that point in time, nothing was repainted or patched because they each kept their own identity. I believe it wasn't until Union Pacific bought Rio Grande and Southern Pacific is when changes became, is when the changes were made. So Union Pacific was actually taking, same thing. They were taking Rio Grande and Southern Pacific locomotives and putting patches on. In other words, the paint scheme stays the same. They just take masking tape and paper, go around the road number under the cab. They paint it a color that they can see. I believe the Rio Grande ones had a yellow patch on them. But the block that they taped out and masked out is called a patch. And then they'll pick a color, and then they'll put the road numbers and the reporting mark of UP. But the rest of the locomotive will still have the original paint. So in the railroads, just because it has that road name on it does not mean it belongs to that railroad. You have to look at the reporting mark. The actual reporting mark is what tells you who that piece of equipment belongs to. And there's actually a wonderful website on the internet that tells you what who owns each reporting mark, whether it's a railroad, a private company, lease company, whoever. There is a nice website to research that. But getting back to the Rio Grande subject, so they started patching these locomotives, and then later on, just like with Conrail, they could take their time painting them. There's not such a hurry, so it could take 2, 3, 4 years before everything gets their proper railroad paint scheme. But there's a funny story for the Rio Grande, for those who like Rio Grande, and I believe it's true. I don't know, but it's a story that I read about 20 years ago. When Union Pacific bought out Rio Grande / Southern Pacific, they brought those employees in, to their company. So there was Rio Grande employees who were spread out within the company Union Pacific. And some of them were not, Union Pacific fans. Don't leave it at that. But they hated seeing their railroad disappear. In other words, the Rio Grande locomotives were coming into these paint shops and getting Union Pacific paint jobs. So they all got the Rio Grande the ex-Rio Grande employees now working for Union Pacific all got together and decided that they were going to try and save at least one SD40-2T telemotor. And they were pretty successful at it from what I read. Every time, when it got down to the last of the locomotives, every time this one locomotive would come into a yard, they would make sure, it was into a yard where there was a Rio Grande dispatcher. So instead of sending it to the paint shop where it belonged, they would put it on another train and send it right back out again. They were trying to save at least one with the original paint scheme. So it was a pretty interesting story. And there are samples of original Rio Grande locomotives still out there. So here's an interesting photo for you Western Rio Grande fans. Rio Grande actually bought ex-Conrail GP40s. Rio Grande always bought brand new equipment, but they were failing financially at this time, so they had to resort to used equipment. And here, instead of a buyout, it's actually a purchase, and which is why they had to be patched over to Rio Grande. So once a railroad becomes another, the old railroad becomes what's called a fallen flag railroad. So when Conrail took over Penn Central, then Penn Central, in essence, became a fallen flag railroad. There is a wonderful website called Fallen Flag Railroads, or Fallen Flag RR. I think it's .com, but don't hold me to that. But just type in Fallen Flag Railroads into your Google search, and it's a huge website that has all the fallen flags in there with the equipment that they owned, the locomotives that they had, and all the freight cars that they owned, along with photos. So it's a pretty good historical site for research. Also, for those who are wondering, and we'll look at a couple of them things, but just because you ran into a Penn Central hopper, just say, oh yeah, I found a Penn Central hopper, that railroad is still around. No, it's not. Sorry. Penn Central is dead and gone. You'll find a lot of fallen flag railroad cars still out there, even though it says Penn Central on it, or if it says Reading on it, or if it says Southern on it, does not necessarily mean that railroad is still around. What you have to look at is the reporting marks. They are only, whoever buys that car, or a freight car, or whoever buys the locomotive, they're only responsible for changing the reporting mark. And if they decide to keep the same road number, I guess that's fine, but the reporting mark is the biggest thing that they have to change. And they can leave the rest of it alone with the original paint scheme and the original road name on it. So just because you've seen a Reading hopper car does not mean that Reading is still around. So And speaking of which, for those who are rail fans that love to catch those fallen flag freight cars, you better get out there and start doing catching as much as you can. And for those who don't catch the whole entire train, you may want to think about it, because here's what's happening. I'm going to put this in here as well. There are a couple of engineers that I've talked to, and the problem is that railroads are not going with railroad name freight cars. They're either leasing them or they pull private ones. There are exceptions, like CSX and Norfolk Southern have these long coal drags, and all the coal cars are usually in CSX or Norfolk Southern. In a Norfolk Southern coal drag, you will see a Conrail hopper car show up once in a while, but for the most part, it's all railroad names. Union Pacific and BNSF also have unit trains of grain cars with their names on it. But for the most part, railroads are not putting their own name on freight cars. They're going with TILX, GATX, Procore. There's a whole bunch of other ones out there that are all lease companies, because the railroads don't want the responsibility or don't have the manpower to maintain these rail cars, so they're going more and more lease. These freight cars, under FRA regulations, have a lifespan of 50 years. So if they build this freight car, it's only allowed to be on the rails for 50 years. After 50 years, that car, whether it's been rebuilt, it doesn't matter how many times it's been rebuilt, it has to go to a scrapyard and get scrapped out. You're going to see a lot of fallen flag freight cars disappearing real quickly, especially in the next couple of years, because they're coming up due being scrapped. And it's going to be a sad thing to see, but so get out there and do your rail fanning. If you're one of the rail fans that catch just the locomotive, consider catching a train. You might find a fallen flag rail car in there. Okay, let's move on, and we'll take a look at some samples here that I have. So one of the first cars that Lionel did in the transition era or post-merger era of railroads was the Conrail overstamp cars made in 1998. And here you can see we have a Erie Lackawanna boxcar, which has what they called, Lionel did what they called an overstamp series. And these were done on a 64-64 post-war molds. And at any rate, so what Lionel did is they printed the Erie on here, and then they overstamped Conrail. And you can see here where they did the same with the reporting mark, which was, you had to do, originally it would have been EL, and then over top of it is now CR, and then the new Conrail road number. These overstamp series sets were produced in 2-car sets, and I believe there was 3 2-car sets made altogether. What we have up here next is a MTH Premier 70-ton hopper car being modeled as a ex-Penn Central, now Conrail hopper car. MTH's version here shows the Penn Central name being removed, and then of course the CR being applied to it. So it depends on the time that the different facilities had. Sometimes they removed the name, sometimes they didn't, but they did have to get rid of the old reporting mark and put their own reporting mark on the car that they took over. and Conrail always mostly renumbered their rail equipment as well. Now here up we have a very interesting piece we can talk about and discuss here. To look at this, it's very confusing. It looks like it's a Conrail hopper with a New York Central error stamp and reporting marks. Now remember, I said it doesn't matter what the name is. It only matters what the reporting mark says, who owns the car. So even though it says Conrail, this is not really a Conrail hopper. Before I move on, this was made by Lionel in the 90s as well. So this is a Lionel piece. They did a wonderful job. So how is it possible that this car would have a NYC or New York Central error stamp on a Conrail car, since Conrail took over Penn Central and Penn Central is part of New York Central? Did New York Central come back to life and take Conrail back over? No. There's a very interesting story, and I hope you find this story as interesting as I did. So here's the story behind the NYC reporting mark on Conrail rail equipment. When Conrail was split up between CSX and Norfolk Southern, their freight cars were separated between them. The Conrail equipment that went to CSX was relettered NYC, which is you see here. So this is actually a CSX transition car or post-merger car. So this car actually belongs to CSX because the NYC reporting mark at this time period tells us so. So the time period that this happened was way after Penn Central and New York Central. But Conrail had the rights to the New York Central reporting marks. And so there's an interesting story that behind that too, because Conrail had the rights to all the reporting marks of all the railroads that merged or they took over. So it would be NYC, PRR, Reading, RDG. So there was quite a few of them that Conrail had taken over. The CSX or ex-Conrail cars will remain lettered NYC. So anytime you see a CSX car with the NYC reporting marks, it was an ex-Conrail piece of equipment. Conrail owned all the marks from the predecessor roads. When the split was done, CSX got fewer cars than Norfolk Southern. So the CSX cars were the ones that were all remarked. A decision was made to give CSX the NYC reporting mark and let Norfolk Southern keep the rest, including CR. Prior to day one, all the cars going to CSX were remarked NYC, and the Norfolk Southern cars all kept their existing marks: Conrail, Penn Central, Erie Lackawanna, Reading, etc. Although Norfolk Southern got more of the predecessor reporting marks, they very rarely used them, but when they did use the PRR reporting mark on a few select of their rail equipment. For those who are interested, the split of Conrail, 42% of it went to CSX and 58% of it went to Norfolk Southern. CSX had fewer cars to re-stencil, so they used NYC to identify them. Norfolk Southern did not use the PRR reporting mark that much, but the cars that Norfolk Southern got, more of them simply remained Conrail. So if you see the cars that are obviously former CR cars, those with CR belong to Norfolk Southern, and those with the NYC reporting mark belong to CSX. So I hope you found that as interesting as I did. It was a little confusing at first, but then when I read into it, it makes sense. So, see, anything with the NYC reporting mark is CSX, and anything with the Conrail reporting mark, or CR, and PRR belongs to Norfolk Southern. So, like I was saying, there hasn't been a lot of transition time periods between the merger of two railroads where it's being modeled in O gauge. But luckily, Lionel and MTH both have seen possible marketing for such a thing. And here we have a Conrail patched Reading locomotive. So as you know, Conrail was taking the equipment from the different railroads. This is what they would have done because there really wasn't a lot of time to paint everything. It's easier and faster to patch it using their CR logo and then renumbering it. And as you can see, this is a GP35. So this is a Lionel Legacy Conrail patched Reading unit. They also made a matching caboose. So here's the caboose to go with that. As you can see, it's got the Conrail name on it, even though it's in the Reading paint scheme. And again, to me, it's a very interesting time period where there was that transition time period, I call it, or most people say post-merger between two railroads or multiple railroads. Here's a photo of a real Conrail patched Reading unit. You can see, yeah, Lionel did a pretty good job at the copying what was really done. And as you can see, the what they did is they took and masked out the area and they painted it in black, put numbers in white, and of course they just spray painted the rest of the Reading diamond there. And then basically, they didn't do a very good job because they knew they were going to repaint these anyway. So it was like a very fast and quick process of what they called patching. Here's a Conrail patched Penn Central locomotive, also Lionel Legacy. Pretty interesting. I could not find a picture of the other side of it, but on the other side of this locomotive is an actual, one of the doors is blue with a C on it. Or the door was taken off of a Conrail locomotive, put on here to be later painted. So there was all kinds of things that were going on that really wasn't standard when there was patching and post-merger, things happening. And here is a Conrail, a real Conrail patch Penn Central unit. And as you can see, there really is blue doors on here. So what was happening is, as the locomotives got painted and they broke down and needed, they couldn't be repaired anymore, they would take the parts off of them and put it onto the running locomotives because they knew they were going to paint them anyway. The Lionel version actually has one of the doors on the main body that's blue. But as you can see, Conrail really did swap out blue parts onto locomotives that weren't even painted yet. Here is a Lionel Legacy Conrail patched Erie Lackawanna. And here is the real Conrail patched Erie Lackawanna. So if you've been paying attention, Lionel has been offering a lot more of the post-merger paint schemes, or like I said, I call them transition time period, where they just simply, patched over the original name or reporting mark and leaving the original name on them. And here we have out of the newer or newest Lionel catalog is the B&O locomotive, but if you notice, it is actually been patched over to the CSXT. So CSX basically, again painted over the B&O reporting marks and put CSXT on it until they were able to repaint them later on. In case you were wondering if this was really done, yes, it was. And not a very good photo that I found, but the best I could do. Here's a B&O. As you can see right here, my mouse cursor is the CSXT, and it's been renumbered. Also, in the newest release Lionel catalog, Lionel is offering a CSX locomotive that's basically a patched Conrail unit. So here we have the CSX numbers 777, the original number being patched in blue and with CSX reporting marks under it. Here's a real CSX locomotive that's patched onto a Conrail, ex-Conrail locomotive. And you can see that CSX really did use yellow letters and put in small reporting marks of CSXT. I just find this error really interesting and how this was done. And not to forget my West Coast rail fan friends, here is a Rio Grande unit that was patched over to Union Pacific. So I hope you enjoyed my video series of post-merger and transition eras of railroads either being merged or bought out. Thanks again, and we'll catch you guys next video.